Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome back to the podcast, man. Thank you for joining me on this magical journey towards knowledge, I guess. I don't know. Today I had Scott Christianson on. He is an associate teaching professor at the University of Missouri. He's very interested in artificial intelligence and kind of the effects that it's going to have on the future. We had a great conversation about the dangers of AI and also the benefits that it could have and kind of the effects of automation on the economy. Just this whole artificial machine learning kind of thing. Super interesting conversation. I appreciate Scott coming on. Let's just get right into it. Broc, Gardner versus the world. Scott Christianson, let's go. Scott Christianson, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great. And yourself?
I am absolutely fantastic. I appreciate you coming on during these insane times, first of all.
You didn't say unprecedented. You're supposed to say unprecedented times.
Unprecedented. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think we get a bad rap. It's crazy and it's different, but I don't know. It's not as bad as it could be, I guess. But
I think you're right. And I think there's been lots of other times where people have suffered through or gotten through pandemics and depressions and other things like that in the past.
So. Yeah, 100%. As this, because you started your own video conferencing deal, right? So has this helped in any way? Like, I don't want to say you're excited about what happened, but it has to have helped you in some ways, right?
So I don't do as much on my business anymore, but for many, many years, I did install video conferencing equipment. Yeah. And so we were, it certainly has helped me adjust to the current situation. So I knew how I wanted to set things up. I knew how I wanted to interact with people over video. And so that helped me a lot. But it's interesting to see how it's kind of become part of our life, right? So Zoom is just a common, thing like Kleenex.
Yeah, right? it's the new whole ordeal. You see it everywhere in the media is now like it's just Zoom. That's the new normal for meeting. It's kind of crazy.
Right.
So I hope you invested in Zoom before all that went down for sure.
I wish.
Yeah. So what are you doing right now as a job? You're at the University of Missouri, am I correct?
Yeah, so I have a great job. I'm a teaching professor, which means I just get to teach courses. So I teach about information systems, I teach about project management, teach about emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, blockchain, all that kind of good stuff. So how do we think about these new technologies? How do we think about, the pandemic's a great example. How do we think about what it's going to be, life is going to be like afterward? How are we going to use these technologies to make the world a better place?
Yeah. So was that always kind of an interest of yours, or how did you get into AI and then I guess teaching about AI and that sort of thing?
Well, in my business, we were in a technology business. So we were always having to look for what is the next thing, right? So you're always having to keep an eye out because if you don't, then somebody else is going to be selling the next generation solution. You want to be ahead of the game. And so I really got into that idea of keeping an eye out on what was coming down the pike. And there's a great quote I like from a gentleman named Andy Grove, who was the chairman of Intel Corporation for many, many years and grew it into a great company. And he always said only the paranoid survive.
Yeah.
So
yeah. It think about that way.
And so I've kind of translated that into my teaching. So I started teaching as an adjunct, found I really liked it. And this was kind of interesting. I actually went in to quit my job and say, I can't do this teaching thing because it doesn't pay much and I'm tied down in town all the time. And he said, well, wait a second, we need somebody who has some good technology experience that would be able to teach our students. So I really loved it. And so I transitioned into that. So I still do a little consulting on the side for some of my video conferencing clients that I've had for 20 years or so. And just kind of translated that into talking with my students. So we're always looking out for what is the next thing on the horizon. And artificial intelligence has had some really big breakthroughs in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think it's really going to change the way that you and I live and hopefully all for the better. But I imagine there's going to be some for the some for the worse as well.
Yeah. Were you guys trying to use AI in your business, like with the video conferencing or something, anything like that?
So AI is actually used for some applications. So it's
Hmm.
used for some cameras. Will use AI to determine like what a person is and how many people are in the room.
Hmm.
So they've been trained to be able to recognize those things. Right now, I think we're going to see a revolution in this technology. Zoom right now is consuming a fair amount of bandwidth as we're both
Yeah.
talking to each other, but new technologies will allow us to minimize the amount of bandwidth it takes. So, for example, I'm talking and my head is moving, but the stuff in the background isn't. And same with you.
Yeah.
So, why are we refreshing that? Why are we refreshing that every so often? Or could we maybe infer from Scott's voice what his mouth might look like?
Yeah.
So, I think there's some interesting ways that video conferencing will save a lot of bandwidth and will allow us to be doing really high quality video conferencing.
Yeah. Gotcha. So I have a couple different things I want to talk to you about, but the main thing I want to focus on is artificial intelligence. And my podcast, like I am just not a very smart person. Like I know some things, but I was just listening to, do you know who Lex Friedman is? The AI kind of has his own podcast.
I think I've listened to a couple episodes. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just listening to his podcast. I can't remember who he had on, but they were talking about like hypographs and just like cognition, like I just stuff I've never even heard of. I couldn't follow. So I want this to kind of be like the basics, I guess, in a way. We'll get a little deep into it, but so for people that don't really understand what this is, artificial intelligence, maybe just explain it at its core, and then maybe like some of the terms that people throw around like neural net and like machine
Yeah.
learning, that stuff.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I tell you what, I've also have a little website. If your listeners are interested, it's called learnabout.ai.
Okay.
And I put some books, I put some websites, some podcasts that are pretty good
Mhm.
that can kind of help you get up to speed on this. But if you think about AI, just that term, it's a really broad term.
Yeah.
Okay, so it can mean everything from the Terminator that we've seen on
Yeah.
movies and all those types of Ex Machina and all these other great movies that have some sort of machine that acts like a human, and you can't really even tell if they're human or if they're machine. It can go way to the other end to just something simple that can make a decision. So you think about those little vacuums, those little Roomba things.
Yeah.
Well, they can kind of make a decision, right? I ran into a wall.
Mhm.
Let's turn a little bit to the right. I ran into the wall again. Let's turn a little bit to the right. So basically, AI is any sort of machine that exhibits decision-making abilities. And so that can run from the very simple AIs, like if we want to even call it that, an algorithm that's being used by Roomba,
Yeah.
up to something that we could imagine that could be this kind of artificial intelligence like human intelligence.
Mhm.
But you're exactly right. There's this kind of narrow form of AI called machine learning. And within that, there's an area called deep learning. And the way this works is that we do not program the machine on how to make these decisions. We simply train it with lots and lots of data. So I noticed there you have some different animals exhibited in your background there. Look like some great racks there.
Yeah.
And if we wanted a computer to be able to tell different species of deer or different species of elk or something like that, you and I could sit there and we could program and we'd say, okay, well, it's got to have 4 legs. It's got to have a hoof that looks like this. It's got to have ears that go kind of like this. And then a snout that looks like this. That would take us a long time to do that, right? We'd have to sit there and program all the variations. What we can do instead is we set up these neural nets, and it's kind of like a human brain. It's really not exactly like it, but it's basically these little nodes that interconnect with each other. And we just say, okay, here's 1,000 images of a white-tailed deer.
Yeah.
Here's 1,000 images of a reindeer. Here's 1,000 images of a red deer. And what it will do is it knows what training data we're giving it, and it will kind of make connections on its own, and it will learn the differences between those on its own. So we turn the learning over to the machine. And this is where we really had some amazing breakthroughs in this field of AI.
Yeah.
And the example I always like to go to, maybe because I'm getting older, is medicine. And there are about 50 machine learning algorithms that have actually been approved for human use. So the next time you go into a doctor and you say, well, I think I might have pneumonia. Well, they actually have AIs that have been trained to look at x-rays and can actually be better than a human at predicting whether you actually have pneumonia or not. And the way they were able to develop that algorithm is I think it was like 30,000 images they fed into this machine. And some of those images were people that they thought maybe had pneumonia, but turned out they didn't. Some of them were people that were just normal people, and some were people that had pneumonia. And so by feeding all this in, these machines could get really, really good at determining from an x-ray whether someone has pneumonia or not. So there's some pretty exciting work in the field of medicine that's going to benefit a lot of people, because these AIs can be very good at recognizing patterns. So if you think about what a radiologist does, or a pathologist, someone who looks at tissue samples to see if they're cancerous or not, or even a cardiologist, somebody that looks at those little EKG things, with all the little lines. Well, they're looking at patterns, right? And so that's a great application for this machine learning. Does that kind of explain a little bit of the field?
Yeah. So there's I've gone on some of these sites, these dumb little websites that are kind of like an AI that you can put a bunch of different literature, like they've put Harry Potter books into it and that sort of thing. So that's kind of the same. And then they'll come up with some story based on what information you give them. That's kind of interesting that I'm glad they figured out how to use that and actually apply it to things that matter.
Yeah. Yeah, there's lots of ways that can be applied. Anything where you can recognize a pattern or try to optimize a process, any of those types of areas. It's very interesting you say that. My students kind of challenged me the other day. I was talking to them about some of these programs that will not just take in text and put out some new type of text, but will take a paper that you've written and will rewrite it. And so this is often used by people that do content marketing. So if you know those kind of BuzzFeed headlines where it says, 20 ways your poodle may kill you tonight.
Yeah.
Click here, right? So you get all those kind of headlines. Well, let's say that you're one of these people and you run a website like that and you spend literally minutes writing that article. And you, in fact, run 20 websites. And you want to post that same article on all those other 20 websites to get people to click on that, and then they'll see the ads and you can get money from that. Well, it turns out that if you just copy and paste that article to different websites, Google's going to recognize that and will deprecate you or move you down the list in their search rankings, because they say, "Oh, this guy's just pulling a trick here."
Yeah.
So there's actually programs out there that will rewrite that. They're sometimes called respinners, and they will respin your article and they will rewrite it, and it's actually fairly good. So I was mentioning this to my class the other day, and I don't know, I don't know where you're at in school and whatnot, but you look like the generation that I might be teaching. And they are all familiar with a tool called Turnitin. And Turnitin is a plagiarism checker. I don't know if you've heard of this or seen this.
I've heard of variations of it.
So basically it gives you a score. This paper has been downloaded off the web. They copy and pasted a bunch of stuff from some news article. You can tell if somebody's plagiarized. And I wasn't thinking about it at the time, but my students were like, well, would these respinners beat Turnitin?
Yeah.
Could I just take, a Broc's article there or paper that he's written and respin it, and then Scott could submit it?
Yeah.
So we're actually doing that right now. We're actually trying that out with these different respinners to see if an AI can beat the Turnitin. And I think they use AI as well. So, it's an interesting experiment. I can tell you from so far, it'd be easier just write the paper.
Yeah. Yeah.
Royal pain to get all this stuff done. But it's kind of fascinating to see where this might lead. And there's great applications for it. And there's probably some bad applications. So I tell my students, would you want me to use an AI to grade your papers? Because it takes me a long time to grade papers. I don't particularly like grading papers. Maybe I could just take all the papers that got an A and all the papers that got B and all the papers that got a C, feed it into an AI, and then have it grade everybody else's paper. Well, that might work for a very like simplistic form of writing or very narrow type of thing.
Yeah.
But it's not going to work well when you think about literature or anything like that, because if we had an author that kind of broke the rules, so like Mark Twain or Truman Capote or one of these other folks, well, they would get an F in my class.
Yeah.
Because they aren't following what everybody else did before, right? So there's applications that may sound like it's a good idea, but then it's like, oh, maybe that isn't such a good idea after all, right?
Yeah, gotcha. So you mentioned machine learning and deep learning were two different things. You want to go more into that? Deep learning is a part of machine learning?
Yeah. So in deep learning, we really turn over all the criteria for how it's going to make that decision on classifying something as a certain type of deer or a certain type of cancer or a certain type of disease. We turn the learning of all that and what criteria it's going to use over to the machine. Okay. So we don't say, I want you to look at, antlers. I want you to look at snout size or whatever. We don't do any of that. We just turn it all over to the machine. Say, you figure this stuff out. Okay. However you want to figure it out, you figure it out as long as you get accurate at it, which is fine. And so that's what we call deep learning. So we're using these neural nets. So we're turning over the criteria to the machine. But it can have its problems as well. So a classic example of this is when Google had an autonomous vehicle and they wanted to teach it what stop signs look like.
Yeah.
So they put out a whole bunch of stop signs or gave a whole bunch of images of stop signs to this machine. And it eventually got very good at recognizing a stop sign. Well, some researchers found if you put some stickers on that stop sign, you vandalized it a little bit, the machine thought that it was a right turn only or a 45-mile-an-hour speed limit sign because it wasn't told you got to key on the fact it's red. It's an octagon. It has the word stop on it.
Yeah.
There should probably be main criteria. So there's this whole other field called adversarial AI, which is how do you trick the AI? How do you look inside that black box of how it's learned this stuff? And so once again, there's some big problems with that. It can be very efficient. It can be great at recognizing patterns. So if you're feeding it, pathology results or something like that, it's great. But if we're starting to get into, it's determining whether you get a loan or not, or whether you get into school or not, we might want to see into why is it making that decision, right? So that's a kind of black box idea. We don't know what's going on inside of it.
And that's one of the scariest things, I think, with when we get into like the dangers of AI and when it becomes a little more powerful is like they think logically, like a human can see the stop sign and with the stickers on it and kind of infer, that's a stop sign. But with AI, it's kind of like, no, that's not what I was shown. So I'm not going to stop because that's not what I learned. Right. So that's kind of terrifying, just the logic brain of computers.
Yeah. So a human can bring in other areas, right? So a child, if they were with their parent, they would start to recognize that their parent stopped at these particular things where these things appeared, but they could bring in other knowledge. They could bring in shapes, they could bring in words, they could bring in their colors, and they would figure out what a stop sign was with a high degree of accuracy, even if it had a bunch of bumper stickers on it. So, so that's one of the things that I think a lot of people give AIs too much credit because if that AI for pneumonia works great for pneumonia. But if I say, well, do I have kidney cancer? Well, it doesn't know lick about that. right? So,
Yeah.
it's very kind of narrow and very kind of specific, the applications we're seeing.
I think I was listening to some podcast, and it might have been one with you on it in preparation for this, where they were talking about AI, and I think it was recognizing a certain disease. And you said it was different in different races of people and different genders. Was that something you said on a podcast?
Yeah. So once again, there's like two black boxes here. One black box is how it decides these things. The other is the data that we train it on.
Mhm.
So if we train it with data from white males, then it may be that other races or other genders are going to have different exhibit different traits. And so it's not going to, that AI that is detecting a heart attack in a white male. Well, we know that for females, that a heart attack exhibits very differently. And so that one AI, while it may be very good in this one use case, is not going to be good in others.
Yeah.
Another example from autonomous vehicles, they trained an autonomous vehicle to recognize humans, pedestrians, when they're jumping out in front of them.
Yeah.
Well, turns out that a lot of the people working in Silicon Valley are either white or Asian males.
Yeah.
And so it did a really good job at recognizing white or Asian males, but a Hispanic woman was only identified as an 80% chance it was a pedestrian.
Huh.
Right. And so now we're getting into some really weird areas, such as what are the ethics that we're going to program into an autonomous vehicle?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you've ever done any of these psychology games. They're called the trolley problems. So it's like there's this trolley, it's going along, and if it just continues on its way, it's going to kill 5 children that have managed to get on the track.
Yeah.
But you can run over and you can flip a switch, and it will go to a different track, and it's going to kill this guy that's just sitting there having a sandwich on the side of the track. Now, do you do that because 5 lives are worth more than 1 life, even though it's going to be your intervention that does this? Well, this has all been kind of a theoretical problem up to this point. Well, now if we're dealing with an autonomous vehicle, let's say the autonomous vehicle can't avoid a crash. Do I want it to plow into the light pole and potentially kill me? Or do I want it to go ahead and run over the dog?
Yeah.
Or run over the old person or the young person? And MIT actually did a experiment on this. You can search it on Google, go to Moral Machine. And basically they said, how would you program an autonomous vehicle? Well, it turns out there's actually some cultural differences. So in the West, we tend to value youth, right? So if it was between me and somebody that's 20 years old, you would decide, well, we're going to run over Scott and let the 20-year-old live because he's got more life to live, right? And that's kind of our value system here. Well, in Japan, they have much more reverence for older people, right? And so it'd be in Japan, maybe they'd say, well, no, I think that they're about equal, or maybe that, you should try to avoid hurting the elder person. So it's very interesting. Are you going to have autonomous vehicles that are going to be programmed by culture?
Yeah.
And can I switch to culture?
Yeah.
Right. So it gets kind of weird.
Yeah. Where do you see like autonomous vehicles? Do you see them being common? What year? What range of time do you think?
Well, I was really skeptical. I was really like, oh, this got overhyped. Yeah. It's going to be 20, 30 years. Well, about a month ago, I was talking with a colleague of mine. He actually is out in San Francisco. And he said, Scott, I get passed by an autonomous vehicle about 5 times a day.
Really?
As I'm walking around. And he thinks that this COVID crisis has really moved things forward so much that people are going to embrace this technology, and certainly the companies are, because guess what? If your driver gets sick, the delivery doesn't make it through. Yeah. So how do you kind of inoculate the supply chain against future pandemics or this pandemic? Well, you turn it over to machines. Mm-hmm. And so after listening to that, I was much more convinced that this might be coming sooner rather than later.
So you mentioned about the virus moving technology forward, and I know that's something you've talked about in the past. That's kind of always intrigued me, like with the space race, the Cold War, that moved technology a bunch in the future, and so this is
Oh
kind of
yeah.
the same thing. So do you want to talk about that? Why do you think that is, and what do you think comes out of this on the other side?
Yeah. Boy, I wish I had a crystal ball and could
Yeah,
tell what's going to be on the other side.
yeah,
But I think things are not going to snap back to normal. And especially in my profession in teaching,
mhm,
I think there's kind of this wishful thinking that, it's going to go away and then we'll just be back to the way it was. Well, I think that in some ways, well, there's a couple things. One is that the pandemic has kind of exposed some of the problems we have
yeah,
with education.
mhm,
Okay. And you're coming to a campus. Are you getting high quality education? Or is a lot of that, beer and football?
yeah,
Okay. So, no,
yeah,
nothing against beer and football. I like me some beer and football.
yeah,
But what is the experience we're having there versus the educational quality? Um, in some ways, I think that's going to be good. We're going to be more demanding of the institutions to
mhm,
provide high quality education. And I think students may become better consumers of it,
yeah,
may not just be lured in by the beer and football
mhm,
and decide that, wait a second, this is a lot of money here. You got to show me that you're going to have high quality education, not just some guy that's going to, post a video that he found on YouTube and then
yeah,
have a quiz at the end of the week.
yeah,
So I think that's going to be good. I think it may shift the dynamic in the power that institutions have versus students, and I'm hoping it's more student centric and more student
mhm,
driven. I would really like to see that as an outcome. I think one of the other things too is that not only has it exposed some of the problems that we have in some of our institutions, healthcare, education, but it's also allowed us to take more risks, right?
mhm,
So when you're in a crisis, you're going to take some risks about what you're willing to try out. So I think some companies are going to say, well, we're going to try this because, we got to do something. We got
yeah,
to do something different. You look at Disney. I mean, look at how Disney has changed in the last 2 years. I mean, or boy, 6 months
yeah,
since they launched Disney Plus. Well, now they're talking about we're not going to do things in movie theaters anymore.
mhm,
Okay, and so we're gonna have premium streaming videos, and maybe you're for lack of a better word, a Disney Plus Prime member.
yeah,
You're going to get to see the next great Marvel movie 2 weeks in advance of all
mhm,
your friends.
yeah.
So there's lots of ways that these companies are reorienting and are providing perhaps, more value than they were before.
Yeah, the movie theater business was something that was going down already. I didn't It was moving more towards streaming. This just expedited the process tremendously.
Yeah,
Yeah.
think about the experience you have in a movie theater. And has that changed much in the last 20 years,
No.
30 years,
Mm-mm.
right? Think about the experience you have at home. Boy, I can't I know I had remote control.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think I had a DVD player 20 years ago. It was probably all
Mhm.
VHS. We were still playing if we wanted to play a movie or rent a movie or something like that. And so that experience has become pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
And my wife and I cut the cord on cable like, boy, at least 5 years ago, if not longer,
Yeah.
and we love it. I mean, we've just gone through an election. I've seen like two ads.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just that alone was worth,
Yeah.
hundreds
That's
of
well
thousands
worth
of
it.
dollars.
Yeah.
So to not have to see all that.
Yeah.
But I think there's a big shift from this ad-supported media into subscription-based media,
Mhm.
and I think it's going to be interesting to see how this changes. I think it has also allowed creators like yourself to have a wider reach with podcasts, with
Yeah.
YouTube, with a Twitch, with other places like that, where you can be entertained by your peers, right? So
Yeah.
it's more peer to peer. It's not have to come just from a giant media conglomerate.
Mhm. It is crazy how I've had this podcast for about a year, but I joined this podcasting kind of community website that just got started. And if you look at 90% of the podcasts on there started 3 months ago, 6 months ago, like just during this pandemic. So a lot of people are moving towards this sort of medium for entertainment. It's kind of crazy to watch.
Can I ask you, why did you create your podcast?
I've just always been very interested in creating stuff. I really wanted to make movies ever since I was like 6 years old. And then it just kind of evolved into YouTube videos and then changed over to podcasts, like long form, because I'm not very funny. So I just decided just to have conversations with people and see what happens. So it's been working out well so far. So
No, that's great. I think it's a very interesting medium, and I'm always interested to hear how people have approached it, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you're like Joe Rogan, you know, that's the big time. That's what everybody's goal is. A lot of people don't understand you can get to that point, and you're like Joe Rogan is probably more famous than a lot of the newer Hollywood celebrities, I guess you could say.
Right. So have you ever listened to Tim Ferriss?
A little bit, yeah. I've heard some of it.
Yeah. He's one of my favorite ones.
Yeah.
And it was kind of interesting. He's one of the early ones. And they said, oh, you're crazy to do something that's going to last an hour. Nobody's going to listen to that. And he realized it was something different, that people are interested in that kind of conversation.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a lot of people just don't have the attention span for it. You see like TikTok, a lot of this generation, it's like, look at something, swipe, look at something, swipe. Like a lot of the people I talk to are like, I would listen to your podcast, but it's an hour long and I just can't pay attention for that long. I'm like, maybe that's a testament to what I'm talking about on it, but I don't know.
And I think, you know, some people are really looking for that connection, right? So your viewers, whether they like me or not, at the end of this are going to get to know a little bit about me and my personality. And certainly they know you. And on Facebook, on Twitter, something like that, you probably wouldn't get to know me the same way.
Yeah, it's a lot more human than, say, like a YouTube video where you're watching somebody for 6 to 10 minutes just goof off and they're not really being themselves, versus an hour of just me just talking, you know? So I do
that authenticity and that human connection. It's interesting. I am teaching all my courses online. My mother and my wife have some problems that it would be really bad if they got COVID. So I'm kind of isolating myself. Not totally, but not teaching in a big classroom. And I have 650 students this semester, and including one at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. And I think all my students have gotten a little bit out of sync with time with this COVID stuff. But I'll have a large number of students show up every time, even though I record it, just because they want that human connection, right? They want to be able to see me. They want to hear me. They want to be able to chat with me. So I think that's what we really want as humans, is to connect with others.
And I hope it moves more into the podcasting space rather than the TikTok space. I don't have a lot against TikTok, but it's not really for me. I like the long form conversation kind of stuff. So so you mentioned when we were talking about autonomous vehicles that the drivers, they could replace drivers when they get sick, and that sort of side of the pandemic. And then one of the things I've been very interested in like the past couple months is just the economy moving to more autonomous, like automation, that sort of thing. So what do you think, what's your opinion on automation, the dangers of it, and the effects it's going to have on the economy and the workforce in the future?
Yeah, that's a big issue. And there's lots of different opinions on that, but there is kind of a general consensus that this technology revolution is going to be different than previous ones. So my mom worked as a secretary at the university, and her main skill was typing. Well, there's no typists anymore. There's no steno pool anymore. There are still secretaries and assistants, but they're much less. But there's a big IT department, right? And those IT folks get paid lots of money. They generate a lot of economic prosperity in the community. So in that case, those jobs that were lost were replaced by something better. But it's not clear with AI and automation that that's going to be the case. So the 3 million truck drivers that are currently on the road in the US, can they become 3 million or 6 million AI programmers? Probably not. So some people have proposed this idea of like a universal basic income.
Yeah.
So we all have some sort of basic income that we prosper from these breakthroughs in human innovation. Kao-Fu Lee wrote a book called AI Superpowers. He kind of has the same idea, but he wants to pay you for doing things that are, like taking care of your mother, taking care of your in-law, or somebody that needs special care, or maybe producing podcasts or
Yeah.
something like that. But something that would contribute to society. Bill Gates has proposed that we charge a tax on every robot or every automated algorithm. So I don't know that there's any clear cut way to deal with this, but it's a big problem. And in fact, manufacturing in the US in the last 30 years has gone continually upward.
Yeah.
But there's this narrative that manufacturing has gone down. Well, it hasn't in the US. It's just become automated. Okay. And as we're coming out of this pandemic, if we have government stimulus or tax cut, we had this previous with other recessions. And what happened is a lot of companies invested in automation technologies rather than hiring people. So maybe they expanded their business, but they expanded it with, more automation. So I don't know that I have an answer to that, but I do think it's very concerning, and I don't take at face value the people that say, well, it's going to be fine. We're just going to have new types of jobs, because I'm not sure they're going to be around in that number.
Yeah, that's something that David Autor, I think is how you say his name. He's a guy over at MIT, wrote a paper that I was reading that was talking about kind of disputing the fact that the jobs are going to be less in the future because of automation. It was basically talking about how with automation comes more need for human interaction, like it produces more, I don't know. It was referring to like ATMs. The increase of ATMs actually correlated with an increase of human bank tellers for whatever reason. And there's a couple cases of that. So I don't know what the answer is. Do you think there should be some sort of legislation against the increase of automation or AI? Do you think there should be some sort of laws against progressing, I guess?
I don't know if I believe that.
Yeah.
I don't know how you craft it, but I do think we need to be very careful about how we deploy AI. So the example that I gave you before about grading my papers, that's a bad use of AI.
Yeah.
Another bad use would be sentencing people. Okay, so you sentence people for a crime, and if you've trained an AI to help you do that, well, has that AI been trained with biased data? Because we know, at least in some communities, there's been sentencing biases, racial related mainly. And so if I'm coming up before a judge, and that judge is using some algorithm to determine whether Scott should spend, a year in probation or 5 years in the jail, one, shouldn't I be allowed to see how that algorithm works?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And know how it's been trained. In fact, there was a program that did in fact do this. It was for sentencing. I'm forgetting the name of it. It started with a C, but a group of journalists from ProPublica actually looked at this and found that there was bias in that training data, and it was therefore informing these other decisions. So I think there's times when we need expert human judgment. And I really think that we need to have some sort of check, almost like an FDA or something that says, here's an algorithm that's being used, and here's the inputs, and here's the outputs. So right now, I can get whatever soda pop or whatever it's going to have the ingredients on it. And so it may be really bad for me, but I can still decide to consume it. Well, Facebook, other places that use some of these algorithms actually to do nothing more than keep us on their site. And to be frank, I'm more valuable to Facebook if I'm agitated and I'm engaged with different things and I'm pissed off. Well, it doesn't say, hey, Scott, we're showing you this because it will keep you engaged. And here's the inputs we used. And, I think that's one of the big issues. And for my institution at higher education, I really wish we would have what we call an institutional review board. So an institutional review board normally will look at research that's being done. So if I want to do research on humans or on rats or whatever, I'm going to have to go before them and justify my research. And I think we need the same thing for AI. So we need an AI review board that can look at the programs that are being implemented in our institutions and say, well, is it ethical to be using an AI to determine whether someone gets into college or not?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but we need to have some body that can actually look at that and make some of these decisions, because otherwise it's just the purchasing and IT folks that will purchase this stuff, and it's going to have this AI built into it.
Yeah. I definitely don't think there should be legislation. I'm pretty libertarian. I feel like we need minimal legislation, especially on things like that. But you were talking about social media, and that's kind of something crazy. I don't know if you've seen The Social Dilemma, that Netflix documentary they just did. That was like, the information was out there, but that kind of just put it into perspective. They just got some crazy stuff going on over there. The fact that you're the product and they're like trying to change your brain chemistry to, I'm reading this book by Jaron Lanier, I think, who was in that documentary, kind of the dreaded up guy. And it's just very interesting. He uses this term called behavior modification. They're just trying to change your brain to potentially buy a product, which is just wild.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because they're not disclosing that, right?
Yeah.
And so they're not disclosing that their machine learning algorithm is using certain data, is using certain data points, is correlating that with other data points, and has been trained by looking at other people's behavior. And so they know that, well, if I give Scott this message at this time, he may be vulnerable to that. Okay. So now the AI may not know that, well, Scott's depressed or he's going through a midlife crisis, but it may know that other 52-year-olds who are feeling a little bit, insecure about getting old, if you show them this nice jacket or you show this, George Clooney looking sharp, right, and having the right tequila and all that, well, maybe if I buy that tequila, I'll be more like George Clooney and not like, Scott Christianson sitting in his basement. But we're all susceptible to these things. And the way these social networks use that is kind of disturbing. Now, I'm kind of with you as far as being kind of libertarian in not forcing people to make decisions, but maybe nudging them in the right way.
Yeah.
So there's actually a book called Nudge. You might want to check it out.
Okay.
And it was written by a guy that's a behavioral economist. And his old idea is, how do we still give people choice, but nudge them toward decisions that are going to be, healthier or better for them. So, for example, if you get a job at some big company, one of the things that you're going to do when you first sign up is get your benefits. And one of the benefits may be that they have an employer match for retirement. Now, a lot of people think, oh, well, I don't know what to invest in, so I'll just do that later, because you can do that at any time.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that a huge number of people never sign up for it, so they leave money on the table. The company would have matched your contribution by 2% or 3% or 5% or whatever it is. So instead, what you do is you automatically enroll new employees and you put them in just a simple index fund. Okay. Pretty safe investment. I think most people agree. Now, the employee can go in and say, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have that match. I don't want to contribute to my retirement. So they're still given the choice to opt out, but the default is to opt in. And so I think there's a lot of ways that we can kind of use that to our advantage. So I don't know of a great example with AI, but I kind of just saying that I side with you on that idea that maybe we should nudge people in the right direction, but you certainly have the choice to make bad decisions, right? Because we allow people to make all sorts of bad decisions every day.
Yeah, that's what makes life kind of interesting, though,
Yeah.
So shifting gears a little bit, one of the things that I had never really thought of before, and this I know was definitely on a podcast you were on, was AI in the war aspect of things. That I had never even considered. And I think somebody on the podcast related it to like nuclear technology. Like it's that powerful, that dangerous, that sort of, you know, important.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in fact, the Trump administration, I think about 6 months ago, issued guidelines on export of AI.
Mm.
So, like whether Microsoft can sell their AI to, Japan or China or Iran or whatever. Um, and the one thing that they really forbid was any AI that looks at aerial photography.
Yeah.
So, being able to analyze a battlefield using an AI, because if you think about it, we have satellites with such great resolution now, but we don't have enough people to look through all the images,
Yeah.
right? Well, that'd be a great thing for a computer to do. And what if we started to feed it some data from previous terrorist attacks or attacks on our troops or something like that? Well, we could then maybe thwart somebody that was going to make a new attack by noticing patterns of movement or shipments of material or something like that. But, once again, you get into some pretty weird ethical areas.
Yeah.
So do I preemptively kill this person when they haven't actually attacked? Well, you and I may say, oh, that's a bad thing to do. You can't preemptively kill somebody. Well, if you end up having children and they're on the battlefield, well, you may feel a little differently about that.
Yeah.
Right. So our perspectives can shift on this stuff. But I do think the more terrifying thing is how easy it is to use an AI. I just got done yesterday afternoon with judging a hackathon called Tiger Hacks. So our engineering school puts it on, but we have students from all over the University of Missouri can participate. They spend 36 hours trying to hack together a system. About 3 or 4 of the systems that were used were using some form of AI.
Yeah.
So one guy had a thing where he could be in his car and he could make gestures and control Spotify just through gestures, so he wouldn't have to look at it.
Yeah.
Another person had a chat bot that was all about coronavirus, and he just basically scraped up the web from CDC and other places and fed it all this data, and it could sit there and tell you all sorts of stuff about COVID. So it's some pretty easy tools to use.
Yeah.
So I'm really worried about, drone technologies, autonomous drones. You could have a terrorist here in Colombia decides to destroy my house. Well, he could leave the drone somewhere and he, heads to the border or leaves or whatever. And 5 days later, it comes and blows up my house.
Yeah.
So the proliferation of this, I mean, it's just very worrisome. I don't know how you stop the proliferation of this technology. And maybe it'll be good. Maybe it'll be something where we have to start to figure out, why are these people trying to kill us? What can we do to, make this not the case anymore? I don't know if that issue can be resolved between, the kind of fundamentals that we see in the Middle East versus, the rest of the West. But I think it's going to be a very dangerous time.
Yeah.
And it's not about like some Skynet Terminator that I'm worried about. I'm more worried about humans using AI to kill other humans.
Yeah. Right? I didn't even think about people getting like personally being able to use AI. I've never even thought about that and using it for evil. That's not comforting at all.
Right.
But to go back to the sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and one of the things going back to social media, they have kind of claimed innocence in anything that happens on their platforms because they say we're not, responsible for this. But one of the very interesting things that we're going to see, I think, is a case involving some of these kind of domestic terrorist groups that tried to like kidnap the governor of Michigan or something like that. They had some plot. And I think that what we're going to see is that they organized on Facebook, but did Facebook suggest that they join this group? So it's one thing if I go on Facebook and I'm like, oh, I want to join some radical group, I'm going to seek them out. It's another if I'm just sitting there looking for my George Clooney tequila, and all of a sudden says, hey, Scott, wouldn't you like to be part of this group?
Yeah.
And I go in there and get radicalized. So that's also a really disturbing area of, how machine learning algorithms can be used to change our behavior, right? Yeah. So could you even recruit domestic people better if you had some sort of AI?
Yeah. So. Yeah. And going back to when we were talking about with the aerial photography and kind of predicting what somebody is going to do, and killing them preemptively, that's probably one of the most terrifying things that I can think of that could possibly be not killing somebody, but even taking somebody's search history, taking somebody's social media profiles, anything they've ever put out online, their past behaviors, putting it into this AI, and then the AI saying this person needs to be on a no-fly list or something like that, and be on some sort of watch list. That's scary to me.
Yeah, so that's China's doing this with what they call their social credit score. So if their cameras notice me jaywalking and throwing a cigarette down on the street, at facial recognition, my social credit score will actually go down.
Huh.
Okay, and so I may not be able to purchase a business class ticket on the train.
Yeah.
Okay, I may be only able to do economy no matter how much money I have. So they're actually using this in kind of a social credit score. There's, I think, I don't know if you ever watched the Dark Mirror or Black Mirror.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that when you were saying that.
Yeah, there was an episode kind of like that, and that's really what they're doing in China in several of their cities. And I think that's where we're seeing even more disturbing uses of AI, is being able to, like you said, aggregate all this stuff together and say, oh, well, Scott sounds like he needs a little re-education. Yeah. We're going to send him off to the re-education camp. And that's what they're doing with these Muslim minorities in the West, the Uyghurs. They're sending them to these basically concentration camps. The Chinese government really doesn't like the idea that you would pray to something that's higher than you, right? So they don't really allow religion per se.
Yeah. That Black Mirror episode was crazy, wasn't it? The social score. Yeah. They had the little app, and that's, I don't know, that's something I could see also in the future, is something with maybe COVID that comes out of this, is you have to have a certain, you'll have an app that says you were vaccinated for COVID, and businesses will be you can't come into this establishment unless you can show that you've been vaccinated. But yeah, that was Black Mirror. That's a crazy show. I'm glad we made that connection just now, because that's exactly what I was thinking about when you were saying that. But yeah, the I don't know, just the AI being able to make decisions for your life is kind of a little bit worrisome for me. I don't know.
Yeah. And like I said, whether it's, for a loan or all sorts of things, these things, algorithms can kind of creep in and kind of through a back door almost. So some banks will actually outsource the decision making on whether you get a loan to some third party. Well, that third party isn't bound by some of the same rules, right? So you want to at least be able to get an explanation as to why you got denied a loan or why you got denied a promotion, right? So, I think it's that I'm getting really negative here, so I don't want to seem like I'm real negative all the time, because I think there's some really cool things that we can do with this, and I think it could benefit a lot of people.
Yeah,
we're talking about automation, talking about truck driving. I think it's something like 90% of people say they're better than average driver.
Oh yeah.
Well, if anybody knows anything about statistics, that can't be right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, it could save a lot of lives. It could save a lot of money, if we had autonomous vehicles. I think it could save a lot of time. It could save a lot of lives from looking at a medical standpoint as well. And so I'm optimistic that a lot of these technologies will be put to very good use. And I think we should be hopeful, but we should really start to have more of these types of conversations like we're having tonight about how do we want this to be used and what are the dangers?
Yeah.
So I think in some ways we need to slow things down. So we need to introduce a little friction.
Yeah.
Facebook has this phrase, move fast and break things. Well, I
Yeah.
think they broke some stuff.
They did.
So I think
Yeah.
we should maybe slow down just a little bit here.
Yeah, that's what I think with both social media and AI, they need to pull the reins back a little bit. I don't think we need to shut everything down or legislate a bunch of stuff, but I think we need to reel it in a little bit and look at what we're actually doing to humanity. Like social media, I think has been one of the worst things for just the human race as a whole, especially after watching that and reading the book and everything. It's pretty crazy. But again, not to be negative. What I'm excited to see how many people actually accept like autonomous vehicles, for example, because how many older people are still using flip phones and they don't really accept these kinds of technologies. And I know a lot of people, definitely in my personal life, that would not trust an autonomous vehicle for the rest of, like, they just never would. So that's kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, I don't know. It is interesting, and it is, I think I'd like to think I make data-driven decisions, but I could see it being hard to just jump into a vehicle that has no steering wheel.
Yeah.
That would be hard. But on the other side, as I'm looking, in the next 10 years or so, retiring or something like that, boy, it would be nice to be able to, jump in a car with a sandwich and a book and say, head to Chicago because I want to see a concert tonight. And not have to worry about driving and being exhausted from doing that drive by the time I got there.
Yeah.
So I think, I don't know. It's very interesting. A friend of mine that works at Boeing, he says that we'll see autonomous drones and autonomous planes prior to cars, because he says in the world of flight, everybody follows the rules, right? So if we're approaching LAX and you're flying a plane and I'm flying a plane and I just motion to you and go, oh, go ahead. Why don't you go ahead in front of me? That's not going to fly, right? That's going to be the last time I'm piloting a plane. Whereas when we get to a four-way stop and I see you and I wave at you and I'd be like, oh, go ahead. Right? So we do things that are not according to the rules. And so his theory is that we won't see that. It will be because of this problem of having both humans and autonomous vehicles on the road at the same time. But I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. We'll find out soon, I think.
Yeah. So you would almost need like a majority of autonomous vehicles kind of signaling back and forth to each other, communicating, because you can't really mix the two. So it's going to probably be a while before we see that be a common thing.
So it'd be really nice if we could just say, okay, next Tuesday, we're getting rid of all
everybody go autonomous.
Everybody go autonomous. If we did that, that would probably be much, much easier.
Yeah. But I mean, it's just not plausible, probably.
Right.
So we're going to wrap up here in a minute, but real quick, one of the things you said that you're interested in is blockchain. And I tried to do some studying on that and it just didn't really resonate. So do you want to like explain that and kind of tell about what that can be used for, what makes it special, what's exciting about it, what can we use it for in the future?
Okay, let me see if I give you an example. I actually have a little exercise I call the blockchain game, and I will send you a note the next time I'm playing this with my classes or something, and you can pop in and happy to have you or any of your listeners join. But let's say that we're going to store all the student grades for the University of Missouri on a blockchain. Well, right now we store it in one central location called the registrar. So everybody inputs their grades into that, and it's stored in this one secure database. But instead, what we would do is we'd have all the professors, all the faculty throughout the entire university have a ledger. So this would be a ledger like a spreadsheet that would have not only their student grades, but all the other students throughout the university. Okay. And so that ledger would be the same. And so announcements would be made through our little network of faculty that Joe got an A and Amy got a B and Joe was taking English, and Amy was taking Parks 301. So we'd all get these little announcements, and we'd record those in this ledger, and we record them starting at the top, and we keep on going down. So it's generally considered append only. Well, what would happen is after each one of these announcements that Joe got a B in engineering, is that we would do some math, and we would take the student name of Joe, the class name of engineering, and the grade of a B, and we'd turn those into some sort of mathematical function, and we'd do some hard math, and we'd come up with something called a hash. It's basically a number that has some unique properties. And then when we got the announcement that Amy got I'm losing track, got an A in Parks, I think. So Amy got an A in Parks. Well, we do the same thing with her, but we also include the hash from Joe in the calculation for Amy's hash. And then Amy's hash will become the calculation for Scott's hash. And that is the way that we chain these things together. So if I were to go back and Joe came to me and said, well, Scott, here's $100. Would you change my grade to an A? Well, I mean, let's face it, I'm easy. So I'd be like, sure, no problem. So I go back there and try to change that. Well, what happens is then it makes that hash invalid. And because that hash is now tied to Amy and Scott's grade, that makes their hashes invalid. And so in fact, my little entry in my faculty grade book will get cast off the network, because every time a new entry is made, we all vote and make sure that these calculations are correct. And so that error would be detected. So one of the things that's really cool about a blockchain is it's considered immutable, meaning that you can't change an entry once it's been entered into it. Okay. And this is why it got used a lot in cryptocurrency, because there was always a problem with something called a double spend in cryptocurrency, where I would send you $10 and then I'd send Thomas $10, that same $10. So I would spend that money twice. But by doing this, because the entry when I sent Broc a $10, well, that got entered into the immutable ledger. And I can't then send that $10 to Thomas because you have it. And the ledger would reject that. It would say, oh, wait a second. Scott can't initiate that transaction because it shows here in this ledger that he already sent that money. He can't do that again. Now, Broc could send that to Thomas if he wanted because he owns it. So that's where we get into this idea of having records that are immutable. They're also distributed, so there's no central authority. So that's useful for a lot of applications. So many countries do not have as good of records about property as we do in the US. So even just who owns a piece of land is sometimes very hard to determine in different countries. So some countries are looking at, could we use a blockchain to record real estate transactions? It's immutable. It can't be changed. You can't bribe somebody. And there's a lot of corruption in certain countries where if I might bribe the local official, they could say that Scott owns that land, right? And I would take your land away from you. So there's lots of advantages there. So it's seen as kind of this immutable ledger that can't be altered. It's maybe free from some corruption. It is very different from cryptocurrencies. It is a technology that's related or used in cryptocurrencies. But when I teach this stuff, I always like run into one corner of the screen, or I put on a different background or something, because some people get really confused and they say, okay, wait a second, you want to put our supply chain information on a blockchain? And, that's about the dark web and buying drugs online and stuff like that. And so, it really is not. And in fact, you can do some pretty interesting things with blockchains. So you can actually do smart contracts. So let's say that you said, well, Scott, this is a great podcast. I'm going to pay you $1,000 once I get over 100,000, views or listens to this podcast. Well, we can actually execute a smart contract where you escrowed that $1,000. And as soon as your viewership or listenership gets over 100,000 for this episode, then that executes and I get paid my royalty check or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So you can do all sorts of interesting things with these smart contracts. And when you look at things like international trade and shipping, those areas are very paper intensive. So they're still using a lot of paper, a lot of contracts, a lot of legal documents. So could you streamline that by using a smart contract on the blockchain?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of very interesting applications. My friends in accounting are very, very interested in this because if you think about the fraud that goes on and all the audits that have to go on to prevent fraud, well, what if you could eliminate all that? What if you had this immutable ledger that nobody could tamper with? And in fact, when those little announcements about transactions are being made, those are actually being digitally signed with some cryptographic hash as well. So you know it's Professor Scott that entered that grade and not some student that entered the grade.
So it's basically just a more secure version because all these little pieces are interconnected. And if one is compromised, then these all reject it, I guess, basically.
Yes, exactly. That's a very good way to say it. Yeah, that's kind of one of the fundamental reasons why people are interested. We call it an immutable ledger.
Okay. Yeah. Gotcha. All right. Well, we're going to wrap up here. I really appreciate you coming on. This was a great podcast, I think.
Well, thanks so much. I enjoyed the conversation and I'm going to be continuing to listen and see what other interesting conversations I can hear on this podcast.
Thank you so much. Okay. Have a good night, Scott. Thanks for coming on.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too. See ya. All right, everybody. That was Scott Christianson. You should definitely go check him out. You can find him on Twitter. He has a website. Go look at his stuff. Listen to the other podcasts he's been on. Very cool guy. I appreciate him coming on. And I appreciate you guys listening. And I would love for you to go follow me on Instagram at Kendall Broc. Go follow my Twitter, Broc Gardner. Go follow the podcast social medias. We have a TikTok, Twitter, Instagram. You can be updated on when the different episodes come out. You know the vibes. So appreciate Scott once again. Appreciate you guys. See you next week. Love you all individually. Goodbye.